Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 115 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. I'm here with Joe Augustine. Joe spent 28 years as a member of the Central Intelligence Agency's clandestine service, working as a case officer in several locations and later as chief of station on 3 different occasions. After the September 11th attacks, he was appointed the Deputy Associate Director of CIA for Homeland Security until the stand-up of the brand new Department of Homeland Security in November 2002. He's also been credited as being one of the original architects of what is now called the National Counterterrorism Center. And he even served as Chief of Staff for the Deputy Director for Operations, where he monitored and helped manage the CIA's covert action programs. I invited Joe onto the podcast today to discuss another one of his assignments as Director of the CIA's Defector Resettlement Center, responsible for the resettlement of high-level defectors granted entry into the United States. Joe has a lot of insight into what happens after someone from a foreign intelligence service is offered the chance and makes the decision to defect. But before we dive into this story, I want to ask you something. Are you an amateur military historian like me? Has this podcast rekindled your interest in Eastern Europe and the Cold War? Maybe you're finally getting into reenacting and living history, just like you've always said you would. If so, you should check out the incredible collection of surplus military goods at krashiki.com. Krust himself scours the continent for the best uniforms and field equipment available and delivers them right to your door. He's got almost anything you can imagine and many things you haven't. Uniforms from East Germany, the Soviet Union, and modern-day Bulgaria, Poland, and Russia are all available. Rucksacks, mess kits, and load-bearing gear are also up on the site right now. The inventory is constantly changing, so you never know what kind of gems you might stumble on, all at a very affordable price. Find it all at krashiki.com. That's KRUSCHIKI.com. And use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 for 10% off your order. Joe, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Justin, my pleasure. Happy to be here.
Wonderful, wonderful. You know, not that long ago, I wouldn't have believed I'd have the chance to talk to somebody with inside knowledge about this program, but I'm very grateful for this opportunity.
Well, thank you. You know, the resettlement program is not known very well in the public, not even in the agency itself. So I'm happy to do that and shed light on a very important and yet very little known program. So over
Fantastic.
to you, whatever you'd like.
Okay, I appreciate it. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself to begin with? Like, what was your path into the agency to begin with?
Yeah, I'm from Massachusetts originally. I got a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth, the regional campus. And while I was there, I got interested in Russian studies and Russian history. Uh, and so I went on to Brown University in Providence to get a master's in Russian history. And along the way, I learned some Russian. And I thought I wanted to teach. So a short while later, I entered a PhD program in Russian studies at Indiana University, which had a great program at the time and frankly still does in Russian studies and Eastern European history. And while I was there, I had a thesis advisor, a man named Robert F. Burns, who was a very well-known Russian historian, but was also on the board of national estimates, on the original board of national estimates at CIA. And so one day he said to me, Joe, you ever think about CIA? And I said, yes, I've thought about it. I've read Ian Fleming books, but I have no idea. I have no idea what it is. So typically, as you might have seen in the movies, he said, I have a guy coming into Indianapolis. You may want to talk to him. And I did. And I talked to him. I was invited to Washington. And once I got there, I came back to Indiana. I was married at the time and still am. And I said, we're moving to Washington. So my path was kind of by referral. I did not finish my PhD. I had 5 years to do it, but realized that CIA was really something I wanted to do.
That's fantastic. What was the kind of the moment that you realized that this was your new path and you were going to stay on it? Was it right at the beginning or somewhere along the way?
It was kind of in the beginning, actually. I went to Washington and met a lot of interesting, and life's all about interesting people in my mind. And I met a lot of interesting people. I was ready to do something beside teach. And, CIA had all the elements that at the time and throughout my 28-year career had all the elements that I was interested in. And, the rest is history.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine. So, out of all the assignments that I just mentioned a minute ago in your little mini biography,
Yeah.
there, what do you think was the most challenging?
Well, that's a very good question. And when I think about that, I would say there are two categories, right? Substantively challenging and maybe personally, emotionally challenging. And when I think
Hmm.
about it, substantively, being chief of staff for the deputy director for operations, as you know, Justin, being a chief of staff for anybody is a 24/7 job. And I was the kind of filter or the funnel by which all things from the director of operation came through me before it went to the deputy director for operations. So we used to kid that, being the chief of staff of the DDO, the deputy director for operations was not a 24/7 job. It was more of a 25/8 job.
Hmm.
So that was substantively very difficult, only because of the time commitment and the fact that you had to be on top of so many subjects at the same time. And after 9/11, being the Deputy Associate Director of CIA for Homeland Security was another challenging substantive job because there was no Homeland Security policy. Not until November of 2002, which was 14 months later, was DHS stood up. So, me and a few others in Langley and Tom Ridge in the White House, we kind of made up Homeland Security for 14 months. So that was substantively challenging. And finally, personally challenging was the fact that I was brought into the investigation of Harold James Nicholson, the infamous spy, CIA spy who was arrested in 1996. I was brought into the investigation by the FBI and was asked to serve as Nicholson's kind of professional mentor. And not many people have done this, but when you're face to face with a traitor, and you're trying to be nice to him, you're looking across the desk at him, and it was a really hard thing for me to play act being his kind of professional mentor. That was very challenging for me. And I did that until his eventual arrest in November of 1996. So
Hmm.
there you go.
My gosh, yeah, that is hard for me to imagine, especially
It,
going into it. I assume you already knew everything before you moving into that position, so you laid eyes on him already knowing most of everything.
right. And I laid eyes on him when I knew that he was a traitor. And I knew we weren't talking, what I was talking about in terms of his next assignments were never going to come to fruition because his next assignment was going to be prison. You don't, the last thing in the world you want is to stare into the eyes of a traitor who you know is a traitor and betrayed a number of people and all the things that you stand for.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. That must have been really, really memorable. I can imagine. How did it feel when he was arrested? Was it like a big relief for you? I mean, did you in any way, get to know him better during that period of mentorship, like come to understand him a little bit better?
I did actually. And if you know anything about the Nicholson case, you know that he started spying for the Russians in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. And at the time, I was deputy chief of East Asia
Hmm.
Division. And so when we knew he was going to be arrested, and you won't read this anyplace because it's not out there, when we knew he was going to be arrested, I flew to Kuala Lumpur and waited for the phone call that, in fact, the FBI had arrested Nicholson. Once I got that phone call, I went into the head of the Malaysian intelligence service to pass on to him. We wanted him to hear it from us before he read it in the newspaper, given, again, that Nicholson began his spying career in Malaysia. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, it was a pretty tense moment, but something we needed to do. And you rise to the occasion when you have to.
Amazing. Amazing. Yeah. You're really there for an enormous moment in American history and the agency's history, obviously.
Absolutely.
So By the way, for those of you who may have tuned in more recently and have not heard anything about the Nicholson case previously, I have covered his case on an earlier episode, so you might want to go back to episode 68 with author Brian Denson, where we discussed the Nicholson case exclusively. That was a very, very fascinating discussion.
Yep.
So, Joe, going back to the defector resettlement program, how did you end up in charge of that?
You have a lot of jobs at CIA, right? Some people claim I couldn't keep a job, but I was chief of staff for the legendary Jack Downing, who was the DDO at the time. And after 13, it's basically a 12-month job being the chief of staff. But I did it for 13 months, and it was time for me to move on. And I was thinking about an overseas assignment, or I was thinking about an area division, as we used to call them back then. Now we call them mission centers. But George Tenet came to me, who was the director at the time, and he said, "Joe, I'd like you to go and run, and as best you can, take a look at what we do with our defectors, resettlees who have, for whatever reason, have had to come out, and we need to take care of them." And he said, "We haven't, much to George Tenet's credit, we hadn't paid as much attention as we should have to the program." And Tenet said, "I want you to go and do that." And then he said, which was interesting, because no defector stories are good stories, by the way.
Mm.
So the director at that time said to me, "Joe, take this job, review the cases, make it a fairer process, take care of these guys, and I never want to hear from you again." Okay. The point being, of course, that no news is good news in the defector program.
Okay, okay, I see. Yeah, that certainly makes perfect sense because they only come back to the story when something terrible happens, as I guess we're
Exactly.
gonna get into a little bit later on.
Mhm.
So, can you tell me or tell us as much as possible about how the program works? Like, for example, how early in the process of a defection was your team involved? Like your team back in the United States, for example.
Yeah, let me just start off a little bit more generally, Justin, and then you rein me in, if you
Sure.
will. We've taken care of our assets. The resettlement process goes back to the CIA Act of 1949 and Public Law 110. And Public 110 allows the CIA to bring into this country for resettlement up to 100 people per year. And these are people who have provided kind of exceptional service overseas. They've contributed greatly to the security of the United States. And we're allowed to bring up to 100. That includes family members. Okay. And I can tell you that, at least in my time, and I've stayed as close to this as I possibly can being out of the agency, we very rarely reach that number. But the
Mm.
point is, when people who work for us and risk their lives for us get in trouble, we have a great feeling of responsibility, morally and ethically, to take care of these people. So we bring in up to, as I said, 100 a year. And, uh, I can tell you this publicly, we have hundreds, very high hundreds of open cases around the United States. These are recruited assets we've managed to bring back and resettle in the United States. And they're throughout the United States. It could be your neighbor, they could be a friend for all we know. But we take care of these people and they're here. Now, how does it work? You asked a question. I'm now getting to your question. First of all, CIA does not want defectors, really. We'd rather have a recruited asset who we call agents. We'd rather have our agents work in place for as long as they can, provide us the kind of information we're looking for as long as they can. And when that access is dried up, or we no longer, or they decide that they don't want to share anymore, we say, good, live happily ever after. But the people that we bring out, those people who get in trouble, either because they make a mistake, their spying activity is discovered by their native country or their intelligence service, and we have to bring them out. And to your pointed question, a case officer who's recruiting that person might make a deal with that agent saying, you do this for us, we'll take care of you. We hope you stay in place, but if not, we have an obligation to bring you out and resettle you in the United States. Now, every case officer from day one, basically, of training is taught a mantra that I'm sure you've heard. It's spot, assess, develop, and recruit agents. That's the job of a case officer overseas. But I add to that not only those four words, but another element to that mantra where I say spot, assess, develop, recruit, and sometimes resettle. So those
Mm.
decisions are made at the level, a local level overseas, and the agreement is reached. And then at that time, we're advised that we have somebody who's coming to the United States. It's then becomes the responsibility of the resettlement center to take care of these people for life, for life.
Hmm.
And oftentimes we're compared to the U.S. Marshal Service, the Witness Protection Program. Well, there's a big difference. First of all, in the witness protection program, they're mostly Americans. They already speak English. They know the turf. They're resettled usually in the United States, and they can get kicked out of the program, frankly, if they sway or stray from the rules of the witness protection program. When
Hmm.
CIA takes in somebody, we take them in for life. That's why there are so many open cases in the United States.
Amazing. Since you mentioned that, I had heard about the public law 110 and the 100 per year. I honestly never imagined that you would get anywhere near that number, and I would have guessed it would be maybe 200 people. If they're here for life, and you're saying it's closer to four figures. So
Yeah.
that's really impressive. That has to be a tremendous logistical effort on your part to keep all of that maintained.
Well, again, it's because we take them in for life. That's our commitment to them. So through thick and thin, we're there for all of these people. And again, let me describe why some of these why some of these cases are problematic. Now you can imagine that you're a spy overseas, and for whatever reason, you become under suspicion. And there are times when the defector resettlement people and in conjunction with what case officers do overseas, have to make the decision with the asset or the agent to come out because they might be killed or they might be put on trial. So there have been times
Hmm.
when we've taken out agents in the darkness of night. You've seen it in the movies. We've taken them out in special air flights. Gordievsky was taken out in the trunk of a car. And here's the thing: most of the spies, if you will, never tell their spouse overseas or their family that they're working with U.S. intelligence. So one day, a case officer overseas knocks on the door and says, Yvonne, and by the way, we resettle Russians, we resettle Chinese, we resettle North Koreans, Iranians. So it's not just Russians, although the Russians get most of the public attention. So we say, okay, you're going to have to come out with your family. And again, most of the spies are male. Frankly, there are some female spies that we've dealt with, but most of them are male in those cultures. And they say to the wife and the kids, we're leaving. And I had a case under my watch where we brought somebody out in the middle of the night and like, pack it up, pack a suitcase, you're leaving. And you can't imagine the friction or the problems that causes with the spouse and the family members. So
Mm-hmm.
we whisk them away. We bring them to the United States. However, they get here, and we talk to them a little more, and then we say to them, "Now you're going to be resettled, probably in a different name, okay? And then we're going to teach you English, and your kids need to learn English, and at some point." You're not going to have the same kind of job you had back at home because again, we recruit military officers, other intelligence officers, scientists, you name it, anyone who has a position of importance. And we say you're not going to have the same kind of job back in the United States that you had when you were in Russia, in this case. And then we tell the kids and the wife and the husband, there's no more social contact with any of your family back home, right? So the
Hmm.
kids who are on TikTok or Instagram or whatever are no longer allowed to retain their contact. And that's really traumatic. And then after all is said and done, we say, okay, now we're going to resettle you in a place you may have heard of, but you have no knowledge of. And then we say, live happily ever after. Now, that's the difficult thing. And that's
Hmm.
why resettlement case officers spend so much time kind of walking through the norms and the normal activity of Americans in hopes that these people assimilate and live happy lives. We take care of them financially, you know, a car, a house, depending on their utility, frankly, to the intelligence process or the intelligence state.
Hmm. That's fascinating what you said about, especially about the kids having to leave everything behind in the TikTok, because I tend to focus so much on Cold War stuff
Right.
that it hadn't really occurred to me until now that you might now have like a teenage son who secretly wants to stay in touch with his girlfriend back home somehow, some way, and thinks he'll get away with it, and he's just opening everybody up to a huge risk.
Absolutely. And that is a incredibly difficult transition or something to accept in this day and age. And have and having the kids kind of assimilate into an American school system and kind of basically forget their old life is a real tough ask, if you will.
Yeah, yeah, I can certainly imagine. So, are there very many cases where the family is witting about what's about to happen, or is it oftentimes taking them by surprise?
Well, I mean, there are times when not usually the family. Well, first of all, you got to understand, Justin, and I think you do, that any person who spies against their country, I would say, is not normal in the normal sense of the term, right? I mean,
Hmm.
I've studied dozens and dozens of, agents and defectors. The resettlement center has a plethora, and we have the crown jewels of spying who are now trying to live in the United States. And I've studied them and talked to them. I made it a point to understand what they think. So when they come here, first of all, there's a sense of euphoria when they first come. They're excited, whether it's good or bad. They're excited. The adrenaline is flowing, right? They have to work through their family problems. That euphoria, after a while, tends to wane, right?
Hmm.
And then it's up to us to try to make their lives as decent and enjoyable as possible.
Hmm. So, on that note, for the people that do come over, are there certain criteria that they have to meet to even be considered for defection? I mean, I assume that the life at risk is a major factor, but are there others as well?
Yeah, I mean, to be considered. I mean, look, every defector, every agent in whoever spies against their country, if you will, are not created equal, right? There are superstar spies, right? Alexander Zaporozhsky or Kuklinski in Poland. I mean, these are the crown jewels, right? So
Hmm.
the criteria is, yes, we're going to take care of you, right? But the truth be known, and in all honesty, every spy is not created equal. Somebody who gives us
Right.
a tip on something, yeah, we'll take care of them. If it was promised, we'll live up to our commitment. We'll take care of you for life. And then there are spies who we say, holy smoke, this changed the nature of our thinking on certain security issues. And like Kuklinski, a famous Polish colonel who for 9 years gave us the Soviet Warsaw Pact military plans. It's 33,000 pages of intelligence documents, uh, 60 meetings, 60 meetings, clandestine meetings in Warsaw. I mean, talk about one of the biggest spies of the Cold War. We took care of him, and guess what? We took care of him a little better than we did other spies, and that's just the nature of the business.
Sure. Sure. Of course. Yeah, it's proportional. I'm sure.
Yep.
So, once a person kind of meets that criteria, even if they don't know it, is it a fairly rapid process? Like, I assume that if they're in some sort of immediate danger, do you have to quickly throw a plan together, or is it something that you need months in advance, or it's just not going to happen?
you know, it, it sounds like a cop out answer, but it's all of the above, right? I
Ah,
mean, as I said, there was one case in my under my tenure that we pulled somebody out in the middle of the night. Uh, there were other times where you could plan it. You know, how do you get somebody out of the country with their family? Maybe they plan a vacation. Maybe their kids already go to the United States or some Western country where we could reunite them and take them away. So, you know, there are time the best case scenario is that, you know, there is a planning phase, and that could be a month or 2 months. And then there are times when we say you're going to be arrested tomorrow. So we're taking you out tonight. It goes across the gamut on that.
okay. Okay, I see. And back to what you said a moment ago about, everybody's a little bit different. Is there sort of like a standard resettlement package? Like, does everybody get a 3-bedroom house in the suburbs and scholarships for their kids, or is it different for every single individual?
It's different for every individual, right? There's no
Okay.
one size fits all, right? We've had, again, you know, you probably remember, and maybe your listeners do, we had the famous case of Oleg Smolenkov, who was, and this is not during my tenure, but I'm familiar with the case. Oleg Smolenkov was our eyes and ears within Putin's inner circle and was the source of intelligence related to the 2016 presidential election. We had somebody in Putin's office who told us about the Russian interference in the 2016 election. We exfiltrated him, the CIA exfiltrated him in 2017. And you've seen the pictures, so I'm not telling you anything classified or anything that I shouldn't, but he had a beautiful house in suburban Virginia. Very nice house, the house that I would love to live in.
Mhm.
And, you know, he was outed. He was outed by a news element, and his life as it was changed the day a reporter showed up on his doorstep. The next day, as I understand it, he had to move, different name, different locale, and I don't know where he is, and I never want to know where he is because that's what we try to do, you know. So he lived very well, right? You know, Kuklinski was another case who he came to the United States in 1981, but when I took over the program, he was still our case because we take care of our people forever. And I met him. I mean, he was living in Florida. He died in 2004, by the
Hmm.
way, but he was living in
Mhm.
Florida, a very nice existence. And, you know, so to answer your question, one size does not fit all, right? It's depending on their value and their contribution to U.S. national security.
Okay, I see. And how much of a say do they get? For example, are they like they tell you up front, I want to live in California or Florida or
Yeah,
wherever have you, or something like
yeah,
that?
yeah, sure. I mean, you know, we once they get here, I mean, these are our crown jewels, most of them, right? They're important spies. So we want to be
Mhm.
as accepting and as generous and as accommodating as we can possibly be. So Florida is a big go-to place, California, but also, you know, we might recommend a place where they may not be recognized, or again, if we're talking about the Russians and it goes differently for the Chinese or whatever. But you know, we may say there's the big Russian community where you want to go, and maybe that's not the best place to go, right? Or the Orthodox Church, you know, has a lot of people who may know who you are. So
Mhm.
yeah, we recommend, but whenever possible, we try to accommodate them because they're in store for a very difficult period where they're never free, and this is an important point, they're never free from thinking what if somebody will come and get them, frankly, right?
Mhm.
Or if their security is jeopardized.
Every day, you're under attack, whether you realize it or not. Your digital devices contain your entire life, your finances, your conversations with friends and family, your interests, and even your movements. And all of that is vulnerable to an ever expanding class of criminals, scam artists, hackers, and even governments. You don't want to leave your data security entirely in the hands of your ISP or anyone else for that matter. It's up to you to protect yourself using a multi-layered defense strategy. Silent offers you the protection you need to keep your data and devices secure from wireless threats. Their multi-shield technology blocks cellular signals, GPS, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, EMP, RFID, NFC, and more. Silent's lineup includes everything from signal blocking wallets all the way up to 40 cubic liter Faraday duffel bags. When you're geared up with Silent, you'll be truly disconnected, undetectable, untraceable, and unhackable. And you can now use the discount code Spycraft101 to save 10% off your order from Silent. Find them at slnt.com. That's slnt.com. Yeah. So on that note, do they have like a security detail for life at that point? Like, do you have people spread all over the country that have to watch them for their own safety?
Well,
Or do they have like a phone number they can call or something like that?
yeah, I mean, every every defector, as we call them, and I told you there are hundreds and hundreds of open cases because they never close. Every defector has a what we call a resettlement case officer who's responsible. You have a list who you're responsible for, and frankly, some of these people are happily resettled. They've assimilated into American culture. Their families are fine, and they don't get the attention. They don't need a security detail. Somebody who just comes out, who is well known to Putin. Well, yeah, then we
Mhm.
have to think about, protecting that person for a while. And CIA does that itself, right? So after a while, we like to think that they've moved on and the service or the country they left has also moved on. And I keep talking about the Russians because the Russians are a little more, Putin is very revengeful. Putin hates traitors more than anything in the world. So when we talk about resettling Russians, we have to be cognizant of the fact that somebody may be on Putin's list. We have to think about that.
Yeah, so I think everybody listening has probably heard either from me or another source about the very famous case from 2018 with Sergei Skripal in England, Salisbury,
Right,
England.
right,
So they were clearly willing to put their own people at an enormous risk and political diplomatic risk as well to get him.
right.
So are you aware of any cases where they have made a genuine attempt on anyone here in the U.S.?
I've been asked this question a lot, and the answer is I am not aware of any success by a foreign intelligence service
Ah,
to do that. Have there been close calls? I think there have been some close calls. Putin, in particular, has a line that he straddles. As you know, he poisoned Alexander Litvinenko in 2006 in London
mhm.
with polonium 201. As you mentioned, in Salisbury, England, Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with Novichok, a poison nerve agent. They managed to survive. There have been a couple of other cases where people have either disappeared, fell over a balcony, had a heart attack, all under very suspicious circumstance. Now, so so we have to be always concerned about particularly Putin and what he will do with his Russian defectors. In 2018, the New York Times did a piece on a man named Alexander Potayev. Potayev was an asset in Moscow who basically identified the illegals that were involved in the 2010 spy swap. Potayev
Okay.
left the country, wound up in New York in a, and this is in the New York Times, so I'm not telling you CIA secrets here, but the New York Times reported that they had somebody had discovered that they were Russian intelligence officers on his street and the
Hmm.
street of his relatives a few blocks away. They were shooed away, and nothing to this date has happened. Right. So
Mhm.
there, personally, and again, I'm no longer running the program, I'm not in the agency anymore, but personally, I still worry about people like Patayev, like Smolenkov, like Zaporozhsky, like people who, have this kind of cloud over their head and the threat of revenge. And, Putin is very patient as well, right? I mean, he went
Hmm.
after Skripal several years after. And the longer it goes on, and we get a little, not the agency, but people tend to get a little complacent, that's the time when the bad guys strike. There have been incidences of people spot things, and again, to answer your question, people have a call number, people have the number of a case officer if anything is suspicious. We at our CIA now looks for messages and cable traffic that suggest that somebody may be in danger. So we have to be alert and we have to be vigilant. And you can only imagine what goes through the heads of these defectors when they think every day that person who's staring at them or that person who is following them, even perchance, might be someone coming to get them.
Right, right. That's happens still so frequently, even now in Russia. Like guys are falling out of a window every week. It seems like from watching the news.
Right.
Less so here, of course, but I guess that thought is never totally out of their mind.
Well, they have been some cases here, but not defectors. Where, yeah, but
Yeah, yeah. There's always a lot going on, a lot under the surface. Certainly, that's drawing back to all of this. So I think I recall. I might be misremembering this right now. I think that I recall reading that Michael Golanuski, Agent Sniper from many many years ago. I think that he was living in an apartment somewhere in Northern Virginia,
yep,
very close to DC. And I think the Polish, it was the UBS, was their security service.
yep,
They were able to get a guy into his complex.
yep,
They just couldn't narrow it down to his individual apartment. But that
right.
is that is way too close for comfort for
It's
me.
way too
Certainly, a guy
close.
prowling the halls there.
It's way too close for comfort. And the thing is, we used to say this about terrorists as well. We have to be right 100% of the time, right? They don't have to be right 100% of the time. But so we are constantly, thinking and worrying and doing the best we can to protect our very valuable spies who are now foreign spies who are now living in the United States.
Hmm. Absolutely. So they obviously deal with a lot of stress and a lot of culture shock and that sort of thing. Does anyone ever, serious, like in a serious and long term sense, do they think that they've made a mistake and they never should have come here and they want to go back to their home country? Is that something that can occur?
Yeah, that's a very good question because I mentioned that most people who spy against their country are not normal in the sense that we think about normal. At the same time, I can tell you after meeting dozens and dozens of foreign agents that most are A type personalities, type A personalities. Many of them, and I'm generalizing, but I'm making a majority point here, many of them are egotists. Many of them think they're smarter than you are, certainly smarter than I was, they said. And they have this folly of, I can't be caught, right? I'm smarter. I know what I'm doing. I'm clever. You know, I don't remember many individuals who don't think of themselves as able to beat the system, right? That's why they spied in the first place, right? It's that kind of thing that, and then, by the way, we cannot keep them, to answer your question, we cannot force them to stay. We can strongly recommend that they maybe not travel here or there, but they have every right, as you and I, once they become one of our defector resettlees. That means if they want to go back, I mean, the famous case in 1985 with Vitaly Yushchenko, who was with a case officer in a restaurant in Georgetown in Washington and having lunch and decided he was going back. I mean, he just left and he said, I'm out of here. We can't forcibly retain them. We can strongly recommend they don't leave. They have the right to do what they want. So, yes, we've had people who have gone back. If you want, we can talk about Zaporozhsky, who's a famous case who returned. And, there are some people who are not happy, frankly, with what the CIA has done for them. So, this is where it gets back to George Tenet's point when he asked me to take over the program. I don't want to hear from you. Okay. Because what happens occasionally is, and not too often, but a fair amount of time, a defector will decide that CIA did not meet its commitment. Okay. And they will complain. They'll complain to a congressman or they'll complain to somebody. And guess who gets called down to Washington to tell them why it's wrong? And that usually
Mhm.
the head of the resettlement center. It's not always, given the personalities of most of these people and given what they go through, it's not an easy task in most cases to keep them happy and satisfied forever. But we'll do it as best we
Okay.
can.
Yeah, yeah, certainly that makes sense. On that note, since you mentioned some occasionally like unrealistic expectations or unmet expectations,
Yep.
anyway, is there anything? Is there like a written contract of any sort? I can assume it's I shouldn't say I assume, but primarily some verbal exchanges before they come over. Nothing that would put a target on them if it was written down. But do they have some sort of contract with your organization?
Yeah, I mean, they mostly have a verbal commitment from us, and we try to meet those verbal commitments. I mean, yes, we eventually go through the process of processing them and you know establishing their new names, et cetera. So there is a contract like that, but oftentimes or a number of times, it's just a verbal commitment. And I'll give you some of these stories are a legend within the Directorate of Operations. And it didn't happen under my watch, but I remember somebody telling me that a case officer once promised an agent, part of his recruitment process, that we would give that person a reverse vasectomy, right? Yeah, yeah, funny story, right? And so he comes
Oh
here
my
and he
gosh!
says, "Okay, what do we do?" Okay, well, guess what? We we met our commitment, right? I mean, there've been
Wow.
we've had cases where a resettled defector will say, "They promised me a Steinway piano when I said I would help you guys." Well, guess what? We got him a Steinway piano. So, I mean,
Oh wow.
we try to meet our commitments. And if it's said verbally, and we go back and say to the case officer, "Did you, in fact, promise him a Steinway piano?" And he says, "Yes." Okay, we're going to get him a Steinway piano. Okay. So
Oh wow.
it's that kind of, we have to develop trust. I mean, we want them to trust us, and we do our best to meet our commitments. If you don't, you know, it just makes recruitment much harder.
Yeah, I can imagine that it does. So it would certainly discourage people from going forward if they, hear some way, through public media or whatever that things didn't work out for a person that risked everything and changed their whole life. And then they're like, no,
Hmm.
no, no, don't do it. It was worst mistake of my life. That would
Right,
hurt the program terribly.
right.
So since you did mention Zaporozhsky, I've been very, very eager to learn a lot more about him. And it sounds like you know better than just about anyone. So can you start again with like a general explanation of who Zaporozhsky was or is?
Yeah, Alexander Zaporozhsky, and I normally don't talk specifically about defectors, but the story of Alexander Zaporozhsky has been in the public media for years now, and frankly, whatever I tell you now, the Russians already know. So there's nothing that we really have to be too careful with. But let me tell you why he was important, and then we'll back up a little bit. Alexander Zaporozhsky was a KGB and then an SVR colonel who began spying for the United States in around 1981, or certainly after the fall of the Soviet Union. But the reason he is so important, and the reason there's been so much attention paid to Zaporozhsky, is because he basically gave us a roadmap that allowed us to eventually not only suspect but eventually get Aldrich Ames, who was the most famous CIA spy of all times, probably. And we had a great team. We had a great team in Langley, counterintelligence team, trying to figure out who it was, why are we losing assets, and that kind of thing. It didn't all come to fruition until Alexander Zaporozhsky basically helped us finger Aldrich Ames. Now, he
Hmm.
didn't give us Ames's name specifically, but because he didn't know it, by the way, he told us enough information that allowed us to focus on Ames. And as we all know, Ames was arrested in 1994, in February 1994. But we couldn't, frankly, have done it without the lead from Alexander Zaporozhsky. That's why he was important. So I got to meet him. I didn't know him when he was a asset reporting in Moscow, but he was a stereotypical KGB SVR officer right out of central casting, big mustache, very kind of animated, fit right into the category I mentioned, big ego. I'm smarter than you. I can do X, Y, and Z, and
Hmm.
I can get away with it. By the way, I liked him a lot. So, he was resettled very well, as the press reported, in suburban Maryland, had a nice house, and he was an important asset for us. And by the way, the reason spies get caught is oftentimes because of defectors who kind of point fingers in the right direction. Ames was fingered by Zaporozhsky, right? Zaporozhsky was his own person. He knew what to do. He knew what he wanted to do, and he was a very, very important asset and spy for us. So I used to have lunches with him maybe every couple of weeks. We go to his favorite seafood place and we talk about different things. We talk about his new life. We talk about Russia, etc. And one day he came in and said, "Well, Joe, I'm going to go back." And I said, "Back where?" And he said, "I'm going back to Moscow." And I looked him in the eye and I said, "Alex, you can't go back to Moscow." He said, "No, no, no, no. I'm going to go back to Moscow because I've had friends there and they tell me I can go back for a reunion." And I said, "I don't think that's the case." He said, "No, no, no, I'm going to do it." So I tried to dissuade him the entire lunch. But again, we can't force people not to do things. So I went back to headquarters and I mentioned to the chief of counterintelligence center that Zaporozhsky was ready to go back. And he said he can't do it. And I said, of course he can. So we had another lunch. And at that point, I said, "Alex, we're telling you, you should not go back because if you go back to Russia, you'll be arrested." Anyway, it was that kind of, I know better than you. And keep in mind, I really admired this guy. I liked this guy. I appreciated what he had done for us. And I remember standing up at lunch and shaking his hand. He was leaving the next day. And I said, "Alex, I'm probably never going to see you again." And we walked out of the restaurant. He went to Moscow. And before he got out of the airport, he was handcuffed and taken away and later sentenced to 18 years of hard labor. That was in 2000. Can we tell people not to go? We can suggest that they don't go. Do they make up their own minds? Yes, they make up their own mind. He was in a hard labor camp until 2010. You remember, of course, the famous spy swap of 2010. The FBI did a tremendously good job they called it ghost stories, where they surveilled and then eventually kicked out several families who were illegals, as we call them. We sent out 10, and this was the Chapman. She was part of the group, and Anna Chapman. We traded those 10 illegals for 4 of our people, one of whom was Alexander Zaporozhsky. The other one, by the way, was Sergei Skripal, who wound up back in London. So we traded 10 for 4. But guess what? We got Zaporozhsky back. And unfortunately, while he was in jail, his wife, very nice lady named Galina, had passed away. He had 2 sons. They had done some other things. And he came back after basically 10 years, kind of a changed man. And I don't know where he is now. I have not seen him. And I just wish him well because he was a real crown jewel in our cadre of great spies. So that's a perfect example of, you know, what they can do when they decide to do it, despite what we say.
Hmm. So that story, I heard that, years before I ever started this Spycraft 101 project or anything, and it really made me just kind of shake my head in disbelief as someone who was totally on the outside of it. Like, how in the
Yeah,
world could someone
right.
convince themselves or be convinced that all was forgiven and go back? So was he the subject of like a very long term careful plan to convince him, or was it, like you said, kind of his ego that overrode his judgment, or a combination of the two?
Well, it's interesting because he created his own kind of East-West trading company. And even while and he got to the United States by himself, by the way. And even while he was here, he would occasionally go to Europe, meet with former colleagues or Europeans in the context of his East West trading company. And, try to facilitate business. So he was, full of energy, full of great ideas, he thought, and was interested in making money like all of us here. He had a history of going back and forth and doing a few things with Europeans where he ran into in Europe, not in Russia, but in Europe with some of his former colleagues. And so when he was told that he could go back and have a reunion, he believed it. And, was he lured back? My guess is that he was lured back and they were ready for him. I mean, like I said, he got off the plane and was put in handcuffs and taken away. So, that there was a plan there. And as the Russians often do, they executed it fairly well.
Hmm. Yeah, he, even considering the 10 years in hard labor that he did, it feels like he got off lighter than many people did or would have in his situation. Because I know some of
Yeah.
the other guys, was it Matorin, I think, was killed pretty quickly after he was caught. I've seen the photo of him and a
Oh,
few
yeah.
other guys.
It's interesting because before 2010, the Russians always wanted to exchange Zaporozhsky, but they wanted an exchange for Ames. And
Really?
CIA was very reluctant to trade Ames, right? And so the Russians had a plan for this guy. And of course, we never wanted to give up Ames, and that wasn't my call, but we never wanted to give up Ames. And so we waited, but we tried, and 2010 gave us the opportunity to get him back.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I never knew that about Ames somehow. I can't believe I was not aware of that. But that, I can see that as being an extremely hard sell, trading an American in America for a Russian who's in
Yeah,
Russia. I can see how
exactly.
that would be a tough sell, certainly,
Exactly.
regardless of what either of them had done.
Right.
But my gosh, yeah, it's so I'm trying to be as empathetic as possible, and I'm imagining, like you said, like the draw of the original culture and the original country, and the, seeing people and, wanting to believe that bygones are true bygones. Like I can kind of see how that would override common sense. It shouldn't, but I can kind of see how it would if you haven't actually been back to your home country in
Right.
many years, that sort of thing.
Eh,
But it's still, it just boggles my mind that he would believe that everything would be okay once he landed.
Well, even the case I just mentioned about Oleg Smolenkov, who was outed in 2019, and I don't know this because I wasn't there, but people say, well, why was he resettled in true name? Right? I mean, most of the
Mhm.
people, the standard operating procedure is to resettle these people in different names, but there are people like Oleg Smolenkov who wanted to keep his name. And the only thing I can tell you is, and I've seen a couple of cases like that. What happens is, people have lost their livelihood, they've lost their identity back at home, they've lost their personal contacts and professional contacts back home. And I've actually had defectors say, look, the only thing that I have left is my name, right? So can
Mhm.
I keep my true name? And I don't know this for a fact, but that, it seems to me, is what happened with Smolenkov, who said,
Yeah.
this is the only thing I have left. Let me keep my name. And it's for his family, it's for his wife, it's for his kids. But then you can see what happens. I mean, he was outed, and I bet $1 million he's not in his true name anymore.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that really resonates what you said about that's the last thing that they really have left of their old life. So
Right.
I can understand that. But yeah, I mean, they're making the biggest of big decisions when they come over, certainly. And I know that even if they make it eyes wide open, the next 30 years, 40 years are gonna, bring a lot of changes and a lot of surprises probably, and a lot of wistfulness for, what they left behind as well.
Right. That's what happened with Skripal, right? Was in true name. Oleg Gordievsky was resettled in the UK in his true name. I think pretty confidently that that's the reason I can't give up my name.
Yeah, yeah. Amazing. Wow, really, really amazing stuff, though. So, Joe, as far as you know, you said that Zaporozhsky, he's doing okay, but you don't know where he is or anything, and you never did see him again. Just like you imagine that you wouldn't at that restaurant that day.
I I never saw him again. As you know, Justin, that's part of our culture, right? It's part of the intelligence business, right? I mean, you're told early on in your intelligence career that you don't want to make friends. If you make friends, it's only because you want them eventually. to do things to help our own national security. So the same is holds true for defectors. I mean, yes, if somebody asked me honestly, I would say yes, I was a friend of Zaporozhsky. But the point is, when I left and a new director came in, or when he was released, I did not see him, and probably I should not see him, right? Even though personally it would mean a lot to me. But I understand. That's how we do things. It's like when the case officer recruits somebody and is running somebody overseas. Once the turnover is made, or once that case officer leaves a particular location, they shouldn't be in touch with that person again. It's a hard business, but you know it, and probably a lot of your listeners know what it's all about. So I'll probably never see Zaporozhsky again.
Yeah, I'm sure that he is. He'd probably be too embarrassed to see you anyway, since you knew exactly what was going to happen and he didn't.
Well,
He's like, Joe, I'm so sorry. You were right. I was wrong. I don't know if he's got that in him.
I wouldn't even ask him to say that. But anyway,
Yeah. I can understand that. Good. So, Joe, this has been a very, very fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it. What are you personally working on these days?
I retired from CIA, and you don't know this yet, but when you retire, you have a good opportunity to reflect on what you did and draw conclusions and make assessments of things that went by very quickly when you were working. So I've been giving a lot of lectures around DC. I work as a partner in a company called Jefferson Waterman International, which is a DC small boutique consulting company. And we have foreign clients that we try to assist in certain areas. So I'm doing that, which is kind of like a part-time job for me. And as I said, I like to give lectures. I'm out there, I mentor a lot of kids. I call them kids. I can call everybody kids now. But I mentor a lot of graduate students and people who are interested in the intelligence business, and I get a great deal of satisfaction out of that. My wife says I can never say no to people, but I enjoy that, and I'm doing it on my terms, reflecting on what I did. I've written a couple of pieces. I did a piece in the Atlantic. I wrote an op-ed in the Atlantic about Maria Butina at one time. So when the time arises and I feel like I can contribute something, I focus my attention to that. And, there was an article, in case any of your listeners are interested, The Economist, including Brian Denson, by the way, who was one of the authors of the Nicholson book, or the author of the Nicholson book, he and a man named David Woolman wrote a pretty extensive piece in The Economist that was published on March 24th of this year, 2023, talking about my time at the Defector Resettlement Center. So, if any of your listeners need a sleep aid, they can read this. They can read this fairly lengthy article by Woolman and Denson in The Economist on March 24th. So, of this year. So it's that kind of thing that I like doing, and I'm doing it. And for some reason, I'm very busy. I enjoy talking with you. I enjoy talking to people who are interested in the subject, and I try to do a little business with Jefferson Waterman International.
Great. That sounds like not just a full plate, but a very satisfying one as well.
It is. It's very satisfying. And, in 28 years working at CIA, I could talk about this forever on different subjects, but I hope your audience got a little better appreciation for what it's like in a defector arena.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. I think honestly that they're really going to enjoy this one, Joe, because I certainly have.
Well, thank you. Okay.
So, is there anywhere online that people can connect with you if they want to? Do you have any public facing social media pages or anything like that at all?
The only one that I do have an Instagram account that people could, look and follow me on that. It's JW Augustyn
Oh, okay.
on Instagram. So that's the only one I do, because otherwise I get carried away and wind up spending too much time doing that. So I do have an Instagram account. If they're interested, I'm there.
Okay, great. We might link that one up once it comes. You'll probably get a lot of new followers after this,
Well,
for better or worse.
uh, I'm of the generation that didn't do a lot of that stuff, and I purposely did not want to do a Twitter account, or
Hmm.
whatever we call it now, an X account. My big leap into the modern era was Instagram.
Okay. Yeah, mine too. As it turns out, I didn't grow up with a cell phone in my hand when I was a kid, and that's
Right,
definitely an advantage, I think, these days.
right. Okay.
Fantastic. Well, Joe, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Real pleasure. Thank you, Justin.
Great. Take care.
Okay.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.